And we've got a hashtag for today, which is UK AGM. So if you wanted to tweet, then please use that hashtag. I think that's it on the housekeeping front. In terms of the agenda, we're going to hear from Brandi shortly. And then those of you who are going on the photography tour of Bristol with John, make yourselves known to John after Brandi's talk. And everybody else is going to participate, hopefully, in a discussion about the culture of Wikipedia, which I'm going to be leading with support from Richard, Stewart and Josie. And then after that, we'll have lunch, followed by the lightning talks, which is, I think we've got 5 lightning talks from different members and staff. And then we're going to have the announcement of the Wikimedians of the Year and the inaugural honorary memberships. And then at 2:30, hopefully sharp, because we've got a lot of business to get through, at 2:30 we'll start the AGM proper. But there are breaks scheduled in during the day and nice refreshments and so on. And if anybody wants to have something additional to what we're providing, please feel free to get yourself something from the bar. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Brandi now, Brandi Guerkink, who is European campaigner at the Mozilla Foundation. We've been working a little bit more closely with Mozilla recently and trying to support their work on misinformation and disinformation online. So I thought that Mozilla would be a great organisation for us to hear from because they're sort of operating in a similar space to Wikimedia, but obviously doing something different. And I think with this work around misinformation and disinformation, really pushing something that's so important. But I'm not going to talk very much about that. I just want to introduce Brandi. Obviously, it's her baby. She's leading this work. So thank you so much, Brandi.
Good morning, everyone. I was just getting a coffee at a little cafe across the street right before coming here, and the guy behind the counter asked me, what are you doing here in Bristol? And I said, I'm going to speak Wikimedia, Wikipedia. And he said, the brain of the internet. And I was like, yes, so I'm speaking to the brain of the internet, no pressure at all. But in all seriousness, thank you so much for having me, Lucy, and for letting me speak to you all. So as Lucy mentioned, I'm the European campaigner at Mozilla. So part of what that means is I work on our advocacy and campaigning team, which aims to build a movement of consumers to demand better behavior from technology companies with the goal of creating a healthier internet overall. And so what I want to talk to you about today, I'll spend about 20-ish minutes or so talking to you about APIs, algorithmic amplification of content, platform liability, and protests against Nike about sweatshop labor conditions. So those things don't really have much in common with one another, and I hope to kind of decode what I mean by that. So here on this slide, you can see on the left hand some protests against Nike, or I guess that you would pronounce it Nike. I should have just started by getting that cultural snafu out of the way. I'm going to call it Nike. And then over here on the right side, you see, it's sort of a data set, right? And the question is, what in the world do protests against Nike have to do with Mozilla's work on combating mis and disinformation? So I'm working on Mozilla's advocacy team to introduce this concept of information as a supply chain. So in the same way that the shoes that you wear, the clothes that you buy, the food that you eat goes through a supply chain before it reaches you, so does the information that we see online. And campaigners, organizations have throughout, not just against Nike, but throughout the organic food movement, for example, the fashion industry, have used transparency as a mechanism of trying to understand what is behind that supply chain and where are the points at which what's happening within a supply chain doesn't necessarily correlate with my values as a consumer. And I think that there's possibly no other industry today that could benefit from this idea more than the technology industry. The reason being that it is an industry where business models are inherently opaque. People are not paying for goods with money. They're usually using free online services and paying with data. And there are a few viable alternatives that consumers can turn to if they decide that they don't like the particular business practices of a company. So in the same way that like taking a cue from other industries that have successfully created consumer movements to demand this transparency into the supply chain, this is a concept that we're exploring at Mozilla, looking at the online information supply chain. So I want to tell you a little bit about this theory of change and how my team at Mozilla tested this theory of change in a public campaign that we ran before the European parliamentary elections earlier this year. But before I get into exactly what we did, I want to address some of the basics, which is kind of getting into a big elephant in the room of how do we make the internet healthier if it's filled with terrible content? And that's probably not something that's new to all of you sitting here today. And so 3 principles that are kind of guiding our work on this and how that support our theory of change. The first is that online problems like hate speech, disinformation, harassment, these aren't tech problems. These are sociological problems, and coming up with that there are reasons why technology amplifies some of these problems, but tech solutions need to focus on the way that those technology problems can be corrected, but it's not going to be an entire fix to the solution. Which brings me to the second point, that solutions for harmful content online need to focus on the mechanisms of digital media platforms that amplify certain types of harmful content and not looking at the content itself. So at the core of this is a problem that I see in that we communicate on platforms that are made for viral advertising, which is a bit strange when you really think about it. But misinformation and disinformation is an example of when that power of amplification is used to spread harmful or misleading or illegal content. And the third here is that in the absence of transparency, technology companies are the ones who are defining the rules of the game. So this is one of the key points in why it's so difficult to think about information as a supply chain and demanding transparency within that. Because it's very clear to understand the labor that goes into making your clothes and whether or not that's done ethically or not. But when it comes to technology, you get into conversations with people who, certainly consumers, aren't going to understand what's at the core of that. A lot of the times, regulators don't either. And so we get ourselves into this trap where we think that because it's technical, there's no hope, right? And we can't understand what's behind it. And this leads to companies really having control over saying, we've reduced disinformation by 50% on our platform. And who's to say any different? When you're operating in closed ecosystems, which a lot of digital media platforms are, in the absence of open data, of open source principles, this is the trap that we fall into. And this is exactly what, at Mozilla, we're trying to disrupt. So transparency is really a first step towards getting at accountability that technology platforms have in solving some of the problems that we see online. So these are the underlying principles that are kind of behind our work on combating disinformation online. And in the lead up to the European elections, we wanted to test this theory. And this is what we were entering into. So this is a real tweet from Guy Verhofstadt, who's a Belgian MEP and the leader of the ALDE party in European Parliament, calling for regulation, saying voluntary efforts are not enough. We need regulation of technology companies. So this voluntary code of practice that's mentioned in this tweet, I want to back up and explain what that is a little bit. So that was is a code of practice on combating disinformation that was signed by, in addition to Mozilla, Facebook, Google, Twitter, and Microsoft jumped on quite late in the game and signed on to the code of practice. And it was basically these technology platforms committing to taking specific steps to combat disinformation on their platforms. The problem is that it is voluntary, it is self-regulatory, and so all politicians and also people across the European Union are saying this is not enough. Who is going to hold them accountable when you're looking at a voluntary code of practice to guide behavior? Who are the watchdogs in that scenario? So this is exactly, we saw our opportunity as Mozilla to try to play a watchdog role and also look at how we could use transparency as a way of holding companies accountable for what they committed to the European Union under this code of practice. So it was a 4-month campaign to basically hold the biggest advertising companies in the world, like Facebook and Google, accountable for what they committed to doing. And our goal was to try to use transparency within that as a way of collecting evidence about some of the harmful things that happen on these platforms especially before elections, to sort of shift accountability to the companies that control these platforms. And we focused our efforts on one of the most controversial, the one that gets people really fired up, being political ads on social media. So this was all, the first step, I'm just going to talk you through what we did in the campaign. So the first step was so Facebook and Google and Twitter had committed to putting out APIs, so public databases of political advertisements that were served to users in the European Union before the parliamentary elections. And it was sort of like late January when we realized, okay, both these companies are a bit dragging their feet on this. There's a chance that they mightn't comply with what they committed to doing, or they're going to do it really late in the game, and it's not actually going to be effective for researchers to have this open data to go in and understand how disinformation campaigns were targeting people in the EU. So we knew that there was a chance that maybe they wouldn't deliver. And then in late January, Facebook actually blocked access to existing transparency tools that were created by Mozilla, by ProPublica, by Who Targets Me here in the UK, that allowed people to sort of analyze the ads that were being served to them on their Facebook feeds and understand how they were being targeted with ads. So Facebook blocked that ability. Those tools didn't work anymore. Fast forward like 1 week later, an op-ed came out written by Mark Zuckerberg in which he wrote how much the company, loves transparency and thinks that should be at the core of the business model of Facebook. And so we're like, this is the perfect storm, right? So what we did is we wrote an open letter, which Wikimedia UK signed on to, and about 40 other civil society organizations, sort of highlighting this disparity between what was said and then what was done, and demanding that Facebook make good on their commitments to the European Union to release an API that would allow researchers to have the data needed to be able to to sort of disrupt that information supply chain and understand how Facebook's platform was being used to spread disinformation during elections. So about 9 hours after we released the letter, we saw this tweet from a VP at Facebook saying, and it was a longer thread, but basically saying, yes, we're going to put out this API that you asked for, of course. So we have a headline here, Facebook answers Mozilla's call. And this was a really important part in the campaign, and I think an important part when we're reminding ourselves that with technical solutions, you can't always just listen to what your target says and take it at face value. We actually need to play a role in setting the standard for what excellence looks like when it comes to transparency. So the next thing that we did was, before Facebook and Google released their APIs, we worked with independent researchers around across the European Union and also some in North America to come up with a list of what an effective ad API looks like. So, for example, if you are a researcher and you want to have information about how political parties or even foreign actors are trying to use Facebook to target people, you need information about the targeting criteria that they put in when they created an ad. That's not currently available in Facebook's ad API. So these sorts of things we actually laid out. This is what this transparency tool needs to look like. The result of that, this is Andris Ansip, who's the vice president of the European Commission, who actually held up the guidelines that we had put together in a meeting with Nick Clegg, VP of Global Affairs at Facebook, and said, how does so Facebook's sitting there saying, these are all of the things that we're doing to increase transparency. And we are empowering policymakers to be able to say, okay, well, how does it stack up against what researchers are saying that they really need? And then the third thing, the final step in the campaign, was actually assessing the efforts. Once Facebook and Google released their APIs, we actually assessed them against the guidelines that we had set forth. And the thing that came out of this, this is just a slide that has information or examples of media coverage that we got around this campaign. And I want to specifically talk about this Vice News headline: shady political ads are pouring into Facebook, we still can't track them. And this is part of the importance in being sort of a technical translator to help people, help journalists, help policymakers understand what's behind the information supply chain. I'm sure you all know better than anyone that, Facebook, Google say, we're doing all of these things to increase transparency, and then tech reporters go have a headline, Facebook increases transparency, and then it's Mozilla says Facebook didn't really increase transparency, and it's this entire back and forth. So what we really wanted to do, a goal in this campaign, was educating journalists on how to dig into that data, how to look at an API and figure out, is that actually the transparency that's needed? So that people, first starting with journalists, but eventually getting to consumers, people can actually understand what's behind the supply chain that they're seeing online. And probably, I don't have a slide on this one, but my favorite part, I think, of the campaign is actually what's happening right now. So the bad news is that the APIs, the transparency tools that these companies have put out, are still not fixed. So I like to think of them as like literally broken products. Facebook just rolled out their political ad API globally, despite the fact that it only met 2 out of the 5 criteria that experts need to be able to understand how disinformation is spreading on Facebook. And what's worse is actually, we just found out that now there's also been this token system that's introduced. So it basically eliminates the ability for researchers to do overnight crawls to be able to produce complex reports of political ads that are being served to users on the platform. And so I got an email. My favorite part is that I got an email a few weeks after the elections were over from a group of campaigners in Argentina who said, we still don't have these transparency tools available in Argentina and throughout Latin America. We saw what you did in the European Union. We saw how journalists are now writing about that these efforts aren't good enough. And we saw how policymakers are paying attention to that. Can we replicate your campaign in Argentina? Will you help us, make this possible throughout Latin America? So that's something I'm working on at the moment with my team, is helping. It's becoming sort of a global effort, right? Where people are standing up and saying, no, we're not just going to take whatever products you roll out. We're going to assess whether or not they're good enough, and we're not going to stop until they are. Also in the US, there's a group of researchers who are putting together a paper that's looking at what Facebook and Google have released and whether or not it was sufficient for detecting and monitoring disinformation during the European elections, and actually taking that to US policymakers to say, as you're thinking about what potential regulation on political ads might be ahead of the 2020 elections in the US, here's what the European Union tried. Here's how these companies responded. Use these efforts. So we're really trying to kind of organize that transnational movement. And within this campaign, transparency was our lever to show these companies didn't follow through on what they committed to the European Union, not completely. It was also our way of getting insights into these closed online spaces that feel like everyday people don't have a say in how they're governed and in how we can understand what's actually happening on them and propose solutions for what better alternatives could look like. And so to get back to Nike, and what does this all have to do with Nike? In the same way that consumers applied public pressure on Nike to get them to agree to third-party audits in this new deal with Georgetown University, that we need to do the same with technology. We need to create movement of consumers to demand greater transparency into the information supply chain, so that we can hold companies accountable for the role that they're playing in harmful content being spread online. And so I want to finish off with this, and then I'm happy to answer, we can talk and I can answer questions too about what we did. But this headline, which is one of many, you've probably seen a lot more like it, disturbing articles about YouTube, and particularly YouTube's recommendation engine that leads people down, a road of, allegedly leads people down a road of radicalization, directs to, towards misinformation. And I'm wondering what you all think as well about if this is indeed a problem with YouTube, what is our headline? As a movement of people who care about a healthier internet. So as Nike protesters got them to agree to these third-party audits, what are we doing? How do we use our power as tech translators to demand greater human accountability over YouTube, the great radicalizer, for example? So happy to hear that. That's all I have for this morning, and really happy to hear your thoughts about what we do or answer any questions about our campaign in the EU. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Brandi. That was super interesting and insightful. We've got 10 minutes, I think, for questions, so if anyone does want to ask Brandi. I just really quickly wanted to say that I think the synchronicity with what we're trying to do at Wikimedia UK and what you're trying to do is around the data, digital information literacy that we're trying to develop. And so you're talking about journalists, but potentially sort of moving into consumers. And the digital and data literacy is a key component of our education programme and working with students and so on. So hopefully they will be the people in the future making those demands and really understanding what transparency might look like. Anyway, sorry, I don't want to take up too much time, but if other people have got questions, Brandi, that would be great.
Thank you. So I was just wondering about what would be the go-between. You are doing a kind of, as people who know very much about the algorithms and about demanding the API, I was wondering what the kind of path would look like for people that want to change the bias in algorithms. For example, the fact that on Tumblr, for example, you can't put in the word but or like boob or something because it's a rude word, so it shows you no results for that search. However, if you put in white supremacy, it gives you a load of blogs and posts about it and about white purity. So there are people that are aware of it and people that want to change it. There's a lot of outraged people on Tumblr, and this is across other social media as well, and YouTube. So how would people get in touch with you, and what would we bridge the gap between kind of morally aware people that want to change this? How would we put them in touch with you to and the policymakers to start changing that bias?
Yeah, good question. I think on the algorithm piece, it's interesting to hear you say, like, you're a person who knows about algorithms and APIs, because I'm totally not.
Your company.
But see, this is the idea, is that I think we're trying to get more, when we're talking about bias in algorithms, or when we're talking about like algorithmic accountability or algorithmic transparency, what my team's role is really to try to break that down into the type of stories like you just told, and get people to understand, like, there's an algorithm behind what the next thing that you're seeing on YouTube is. That doesn't have to be a really scary technical problem. It's like highlighting this is bad and so it needs to change. And I think the how that changes, what we're trying to do is really work with independent researchers to try to get information about how these algorithms are currently working, so that solutions can be proposed, but also harms can be identified. So for example, if YouTube say that they did recommend climate change denial videos, however many millions of times in the middle of a heat wave in Europe, that hints at some level of accountability, right? That the platform has. And so two concrete things, I think, in terms of ways to get people in touch. One is that my colleagues, there is this ethical computer science challenge that my colleagues at Mozilla work on, which focuses on getting ethics into the curriculum of computer science students in a more robust way that addresses some of and algorithmic accountability is a really key part of that. And then in terms of like people who want to be activists on this issue, I think we're looking at launching a public campaign targeting YouTube in the next coming months, and so would be happy to talk more about that and how people can get involved in it.
Not to get too philosophical, but is there not like a kind of inherent contradiction between the idea of a company wanting to maximize its profits and introducing any kind of level of morality into that decision-making process? So like, I often think that the difference between the kind of attention economy that you have with Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, whatever, where the company's just going, how can we make people stay on this platform so that we can get more advertising money out of them, whether or not they're like, a person who's looking for cat videos or like a Nazi looking for Nazi videos. Like the profit-making, demand there doesn't make any distinction between those kinds of people. And it's only when you go, maybe we shouldn't be providing Nazi content to Nazis that you start to, and I think so. Perhaps what Wikipedia does well in this respect is when people go down a rabbit hole of looking at Wikipedia articles, it's not because there's a kind of attention economy there that's feeding them dopamine releases so that they can stay on the platform. It's because there's no advertising there. So is the only answer just like choose a different business model than advertising?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is that, like, although obviously the profit motive is there, that's not the stated mission of a lot of these companies. So, and that's this strange, like, anomaly, I think, but that's confusing to consumers as well. There's like an inherent contradiction between our goal is to connect the world and our goal is to keep you on our platform as long as possible so that we can increase advertising revenue. And if you're not aware of that as a user, which I think many people aren't, then you can't make an informed choice about whether or not you want to support that. So I think that's where, like, the education part of what we're trying to do comes into it, is it actually let people know that, you know, there's not just a potential that you might be getting radicalized on YouTube, there's a potential that YouTube profits from it. And that, again, I think shifts the level of accountability a bit more. But I hear you on, like, there is an inherent contradiction, but I think pointing out, like, the stated missions of a lot of these companies is a helpful tactic that we have in our back pocket.
John? Okay, Doug and then John.
Thanks, Liz. Can I make a suggestion to you that,
Please.
that good as it is to look at solutions such as, let's cut out the white supremacy from YouTube, that solutions which involve censorship are inherently going to be not solutions, they're just sticking plasters that you're trying to put over them.
My point was that the censorship is already happening with things like farm food.
For sure.
Rude words.
For sure. But, I mean, I was just using that as an example of what we're looking at in terms of sticking plaster fixes. And I think that that's going to be the same for most of them. Is not the fundamental problem with the audience, not with the means of producing information for them. If we had a better educated audience, then that is the ultimate disinfectant against disinformation. Give them the information. And I mean, I know that's kind of a difficult goal to aim for, but at the end of the day, can we never solve these problems simply by looking at each thing that comes up because you're playing whack-a-mole? But if you can actually get people to think critically, if we can educate our kids to be questioning about what's being fed to them, if we can give them a place like Wikipedia where they can actually find real information as opposed to disinformation, is that not the best solution in the long term?
I think it's both and. Like, we did a survey of Mozilla supporters in, we actually put it out globally, and one of the top, we asked people basically, what do you think about mis and disinformation, and how do you want us as Mozilla to tackle the problem? And one of the key responses that people got back was, we want better information about how to spot mis and disinformation, exactly what you're saying. Like, we want to be able to be educated and empowered to understand it. But, for example, in this campaign, Mozilla built a tool to help people analyze the ads that they were seeing on Facebook, and then that tool got blocked, right? So, like, I think that there are issues as well when you're operating by a certain company or platform's rules about what can and cannot be, and the fact is that people are on Facebook. So if they block access to this tool, then education, only goes so far. So I think you have to tackle it also at the level of kind of the infrastructure behind platforms that amplifies certain types of content. Because I think there's one way of looking at it that says, like, people exploit Facebook, for example, to spread disinformation. And there's another camp of people, I probably put myself in, that says, no, people use Facebook exactly the way it's intended to be used. So when people are spreading disinformation, that is literally the point. That's the same viral capability that allows, like, the ice bucket challenge. Like, the infrastructure behind that is exactly the same. So I think that you have to kind of tackle it from both angles. But I'd love to learn more from you all here about kind of how you see the information angle, because it's been tough. We've tried to tackle that mostly through building tools that users can use, and then inevitably you run into the problems like we did with the Facebook tool. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure how this is a question.
Okay.
But I read
okay.
something amazing the other day that was about like the competence of the companies. Like YouTube has introduced algorithms to try and get rid of some of the white supremacy content.
Yeah.
I watch some YouTube channels that are like explaining and like debunking white supremacy, and they get blocked because the white supremacists are like dog whistling,
Right.
and the people trying to debunk it are being direct. So they'll use the symbols of white supremacy, and the white supremacists talk about identity politics and all this kind of stuff. They'll like cover it over. Yeah, that's not a question.
It's not. But I know, because I saw a headline and just like threw my hands up. I was like, why do I do this work? That was like it was about history teacher, a school teacher, trying to upload videos about the history of Nazism, and they got blocked from YouTube, and it was like, oh, this is exactly what, like, this is information, right? Critical. And so I was just really like, I don't even know what to do anymore. But I think that what we, I think also try to focus on is like, if YouTube has recently made a claim that they have decreased the amount of content that their platform, borderline or extreme content, that their platform recommends to users in the US by 50%. But there's absolutely no way of knowing whether or not that is actually the case. So our work is trying to focus, I think it might get at the censorship question, or like point a little bit too, is not on like what should people be able or not be able to upload, but what are platforms actively recommending? And that is like a key difference that I think shifts the question on accountability, and also shifts the question on what can transparency uncover as a way of being able to get closer to solutions.
Yeah. Are there any final questions? Just over time. Just a personal anecdote. People in my team have watched over the past few years New Despair, and at watching my teenage stepson being sort of quite insidiously seduced by the alt-right online. And I think we've got through that, but I've seen the way that his Facebook page looks completely different to my Facebook page in terms of the things he's being fed. So, I've sort of seen the dangers of that, and I completely take Doug's point about education. But I think it probably does have to be a two-pronged approach if we're actually going to shift this thing. So thank you so much, Brandi. It's been really fascinating hearing you talk, and thanks for engaging with it and asking questions.